Hello everyone, Scarlett here again with our next installment of Tormented Past, and today we will be starting on Chapter 6, First Rebirth. Let's jump right in. Several days after the failed suicide attempt, James stands in front of the mirror thinking it's time to make a change. He decides to focus even more on his training to help him clear his mind and get him back on track. He spars with Daniel and Marcus at least twice a day to stay sharp and on top of his game. He switches between the two mornings and evenings to prevent things from getting boring. One evening, while sparring with Marcus, Paul Sr. sees that James is having an intense and focused session. He decides that he wants to step in there with James to teach his grandson a valuable lesson in keeping his cool so he can prevent people from taking advantage of his temper. Entertained by the idea of sparring with Paul, James signals Marcus to step aside so that things can get started and he can be taught the so-called lesson. Paul comes face to face with the amused and laughing James. He takes offense at how lightly James is taking him and puts James in a tight sleeper hold. James tries to escape but is unable to and struggles, all the while continuing to laugh. He's finding everything that Paul is doing is so predictable and easy to escape, but is allowing Paul to believe that he has the upper hand. The laughter is keeping Paul ahead of James, who's starting to feel weakened by the hold. Paul doesn't find it amusing, so he's trying to teach James a lesson in respect. Paul kicks James in the back of the leg, pushes James to the ground, and quickly transitions into a figure-4 leg lock, causing James to scream out in agony. The hold was applied to perfection by Paul, but then James goes silent and zones out, blocking out the pain. Now, numbed to the pain, James sits up and locks eyes with Paul while starting to break the hold. Paul is horrified at the thought that James can take so much torment and not be bothered at all. Paul tries to apply more pressure. By the expression on both of their faces, it's clear to Marcus that they're no longer playing, but he pleads with them to stop this nonsense. He knows that they need to learn to get along if they are going to keep getting involved in each other's lives. Paul admits to having been out of line, but that it only happened because James laughed at him, leaving him feeling disrespected. It all escalated rather quickly from there. But James has no interest in playing nice. Sitting on the floor next to each other, as Paul goes to stand up, James notices Paul's left ankle is extremely close to him. Without a thought, he snatches it up to an ankle lock, and Paul screams out in pain, and tears run down his face. Marcus tries to get James to break the hold. The screaming intensifies and is accompanied between the deafening screams with a loud crack and pop, followed by a loud laugh from James, who knows he just snapped Paul's ankle. Marcus grabs James by the shoulders to prevent things from escalating any further, and Paul cowers in the corner, hoping to get out of James's reach. Not yet satisfied, James tries to go for a leg bar in order to break the leg. Marcus tries with all his might to prevent additional damage when he sees a demonic look in James's eyes, quite different from anything he's ever seen before. Even the Dark Wolf hadn't demonstrated this much hatred in a glance. Locking eyes with Marcus, James begins to question Marcus's loyalty. James sees this as a great opportunity to take care of Paul once and for all. But instead, Marcus wants there to be mercy, something that James was never given and has no interest in giving. Taken aback, Marcus says it's not about siding with Paul. It's more about saving James from his darkness. Once it descends, it appears that James won't be able to get out of it. Looking at Marcus, James says the fact that he's willing to adjust to his new life is a sign that things are evolving. Marcus defiantly tells James that if he wants to get Paul and put an end to all this, he'll have to go through him. Contemplating what to do next, James walks up and stands nose to nose with Marcus before letting out a chuckle and taking a few steps back. Turning to Paul, James tells him that the only reason he's showing any mercy is because he doesn't want to fight and hurt a brother, and Paul should express his gratitude to Marcus. Cringing and wincing, Paul thanks Marcus. Then he looks at James and says, "This is the beginning of a new war, one you can't win. I don't care if you're darker now and scary as F. There's no way vengeance won't be sought." Marcus stands between them as James is ready to pounce on Paul at a moment's notice, but is hesitant because Marcus is standing his ground between them. In hopes of calming down James, Marcus instructs Paul to leave. Paul doesn't think twice and limps away as Marcus tells James that they need to put an end to the rivalry if he's to gain any peace and make William proud. Recalling that Anastasia once told him she honestly believes someday James will come towards her, slithering on his stomach with nowhere else to go, James laughs at the notion. He lives to prove all doubters wrong, as it's been extremely satisfying to do so far. Respecting Marcus's concerns, and the fact that Marcus has always had James's well-being in mind, he considers listening to him. Marcus has never wronged him, and James decides that it's time to focus on Myra to make things right between them without the ghosts of his past tormenting him. Myra's a great girl, but James knows she's no Tanya. James didn't want to let go of her, but knew that it was the right thing to do to save her from any type of heartache or harm. He wanted to maintain a healthy friendship, but that was ruined as things quickly changed after the breakup. It was too painful for her to watch on as James carried on with his life. So, despite his regret and desire to get back with Tanya, James focuses on Myra. He loves the fact that she's a little under 5 feet tall. It makes it interesting for them given she enjoys the kinkier side of James and he can toss her around the room. She's never been around someone like him. Believing in James when he wouldn't believe in himself, Myra has been there to push him. Her biggest fear was that James would give up on his education when he was willing to drop it all and go after his dream, leaving him without the means to take care of himself. She was the driving force between his finishing high school and going off to college, and she forced James to make more of an effort in school and would reward his hard work. James, for his part, learned to appreciate her efforts through the incentives she provided. He actually enjoyed going to class with her since it meant they would spend more time together, and he tried to constantly let her know how much he loved having her in his life. But the fighting events put a strain on their relationship. Even though Myra knew they were something James loved more than anything and would pursue regardless of her not sharing an appreciation for them. He was happy but deadly in the ring and unable to manage and stabilize him any longer. Myra turned to the one person who had managed to keep him in line for so long. When Myra accidentally bumped into her at the store, Myra knew she had to talk to Tanya about James. Swallowing her pride, Myra turned to Tanya and was surprised at how receptive Tanya was towards her. Tanya told Myra that James was like a beast, a mixture of a caged animal and an innocent boy. And at times, it can be overwhelming because it's the animal that gets the best of him and will go off letting emotions run wild without ever thinking about the consequences. She adds that James only cares about 2 things at this point. First, being loved and feeling like he belongs, and secondly, hurting people who step foot in the ring because it provides an outlet and a possible ticket out of town. Myra tells Tanya it's difficult for her to accept the fact that they have a bigger role in James's life, she will have to turn away from her beliefs and show an interest in his. She doesn't believe that people should be hurt for sport. Tanya is empathetic when she states that this isn't a lifestyle to which everyone can adjust. James understands that and has never forced or begged anyone to stand by his side to support him in his preferences. He's a firm believer in free will. But she adds, if Tanya is serious about wanting to keep James, making an effort will go a long way with James. He respects people who at least try and fail instead of never trying at all. Myra's fearful that even her greatest efforts could still end up leaving her brokenhearted, with James deciding that it might be time to move on to the next chapter of his life. To this, Tanya agrees there needs to be an understanding between them because no one should be led on to believe that things are perfectly fine when they're not. Myra accepts Tanya's suggestions and says that she will try her best. She will attend one of his upcoming matches at the cemetery. She hated her previous experience there and drew a line because she wasn't willing to disrespect someone's resting place. Events at the park, field, and schools were easier to handle. Tanya wishes her nothing but the best because Tanya wants nothing but happiness for James. If Myra can provide that, all the better. She hands Myra her number just in case there's ever any trouble or feels she needs to talk. Just as they go to leave, Tanya turns around to provide Myra with a little more background. She asks if Myra knew that John raised James as a prince, but on his passing and James's move here, things turned bad very quickly, and he was treated like a piece of crap by those who were meant to be there for him. Myra feels horrible hearing the news. She figured there were many things in his life that he hasn't shared yet, but never imagined how bad they could be. She promises Tanya that she will be more understanding and that James will receive all that attention and support he deserves. Reassured, Tanya smiles as she walks towards her car. The following day, after a long day at school, with courage from a bottle of wine in her school locker, Myra heads to the cemetery where she sees that James and a group of people that includes Daniel and Marcus are preparing for the match. While others are setting up the area with chairs, ladders, barbed wire, and kendo sticks, and other assorted objects. James is surprised to see her, as well as by kissing him and slapping his butt, which leaves him confused. This behavior is very out of character for her, since she is more of a nerdy and religiously reserved type. Myra tells him she's going to work harder in the relationship and put more of an effort by supporting his fights. James is thrilled, aware that she's been vocal against all things he likes, but he tells her he appreciates her being there and what she's told him and can't wait to see what she has in mind for later. Continuing, Myra suggests that since the match isn't until later, they have time to start off with the biggest surprise first and finish off with the match. Finding it extremely hard to contain his excitement, James agrees and they walk around the cemetery with Myra leading the way. Going to the other side of the cemetery, far away from the others. Once there, she starts kissing him and puts her left hand down his pants. He's shocked and thrilled. This has been one of his fantasies, and he goes along with it. She's not doing things she normally wouldn't even consider, and he's not going to turn it away. Dropping her underwear, but keeping her uniform skirt on, Myra jumps on top of a tomb and bites her lips from the shock. There's no shade in the entire cemetery, and it's hot as hell out. Even the stone is as hot as can be, to the point that it's painful. But she takes one for the relationship just to make James happy. Opening her legs, she signals for James to come over, and he happily rushes to her. She smiles, knowing that she's earning points with him. Just as he reaches her, she puts her hand up to stop him in place and takes her shirt off, lying down on the tomb, sending a chill down her back in the process. James stares into her green-gray eyes, not wanting the moment to end. Grateful for all the effort she's made to make this happen, James kisses her passionately, but at the same time looks at his watch to see what time it is. He doesn't want to miss his match, but is conflicted because he doesn't want to leave her either. Seeing James and Myra in the distance, Marcus is happy to see James doing something other than training, fighting, or trying to hurt someone. James looks back and sees that he's being watched and waves. As Myra smiles, and tells him to focus on her. James chuckles and tells her his focus is solely on her and there's no other place in the world he would rather be, and kisses her again. Moaning, Myra tells him that since they've gone this far, she would like to carry his child one day and possibly even get married in the near future. James is suddenly concerned. He has no plans of getting married anytime soon and certainly has no intentions of having kids, if ever. So tells her to turn over, and he slides himself into her butt to prevent her from locking him in place by starting a family. She winces in pain until he finishes. Yeah. When they're done, Myra looks at James, telling him that this was an unbelievable experience and something she'll never forget. While they get back up and she puts her clothes back on, James agrees. Then they start back to the other side for his match. As James enters the ring, Myra sits down in the front row with Daniel and Marcus and starts her homework, and only looks up a few times to peek at the match as it gets underway. A drained James is trying to move around the ring, but is clearly several steps slower and gets tied up in the ropes. As the beating with the kendo stick begins, he glances over at Myra and smiles. Out of nowhere, the expression on his face changes and the smile fades away. Marcus quickly notices the change and instructs Myra to turn away and not look towards the ring. The match is over and she won't like what's about to happen. What is about to happen will give her nightmares and most likely will forever change the way she looks at James. She follows Marcus's advice and focuses on her assignment, but hears James's opponent starts screaming. James is taking control of the match. His opponent tries to fight back from the floor, but gets kicked in the face for his efforts. James picks him up off the floor and throws him into the barbed wire, quickly wrapping him in it before throwing him into an open grave, thus winning the match. Looking out of the ring, James knows that he might have taken things a bit too far, especially with this being Myra's first event. But when he looks towards her, James sees Marcus looking at him and mouthing to him that it's okay. James responds by mouthing, "Thank you." He knows that Marcus protected her from seeing the horror he just inflicted. Several weeks have passed, graduation is approaching, and James becomes more focused on work in the upcoming weeks, thinking to skip graduation altogether to get in more work and training. He has dyed his hair blonde, changing his personality once more, and he's become calmer. Myra appreciates that change from his usual aggressive side, but he hasn't seen her as much as she would like, as well as having managed to do things that would annoy her. Whether or not she knew of them, James no longer cares how she feels about their relationship, since they have such different views on the future. Shortly after graduation, Myra tells James that she's going to college in Southern California and how much she would like him to move there with her. She's done the research and there are great training facilities there. Shocked, James can't believe what he's hearing. He never wanted to go to California because he didn't feel it would be beneficial for him in attaining anything he wants to achieve. He tells her he's sorry, but he's not going. He's no longer interested in going to college and pursuing things they had put so much hard work into. So, all the work and time she invested was going to be wasted on nothing. It wouldn't be fair to her to see it all unfold. They can always be friends, and he'll always have her back no matter what happens. He knows that whatever she decides to do, she'll be successful, since that is just who she is, and one day she will change the world. Heartbroken, Myra asks for an apology because he has led her to believe they would be together forever. He refuses because he never made such promises. The moment he told her he wouldn't apologize, Myra became so irate she started hitting him, causing him to smile. He tells her she needs to stop hitting him. The reason he's not going to apologize isn't because he doesn't want to, but because he's unable to do so due to his pride. He feels he didn't do anything wrong. Therefore, there's no need to apologize. Upset, Myra cries and leaves the room, leaving James confused. She's walking away from him. Despite his feeling he did nothing to warrant this reaction. And he realizes that this could be the moment he loses another special person, or at the very minimum, changes the foundation of their friendship. From that very moment, things were never the same between them. Myra went off to college. James finally realized a few months later that it would have been the best to apologize to save their friendship, but he did it at a point when it was too late, and the damage was already done. After the apology, he saw her 2 or 3 more times before he moved to New Jersey with a cousin. He wanted to get away from the family and getting involved in other situations. The day James left for New Jersey, Paul walked up to him saying there was something they needed to discuss. James needed to know certain things, and if he were to leave without talking, Paul was aware that the opportunity would never present itself again. Knowing it would be the last time they see each other face to face, James agrees to hear Paul out. Grateful, Paul tells James that what he had to say will come as a surprise, but it's all true and he's not going to hold anything back. James is a grown man who can take care of himself, to which James replies saying that even before being a grown man, he's been taking care of himself thanks to all of them making his life a living hell. Paul knows there's nothing he could say to erase their history, no matter how they feel about each other. They're still family, and he loves James regardless. He's sorry about how things were between them. He goes on to talk about the war between the two families. It started because Anastasia saw how hurt he was when John swept Hannah off her feet, leaving the family behind. It left him crushed, losing his favorite daughter to his best friend. A teary-eyed Paul is visibly upset and apologizes again. Things could have been different, he tells James. If it weren't for Anastasia constantly being in his ear and convincing him that James had to be stopped from achieving something great, he had to pay for the sins of the father. He goes on to say he loved James dearly from the moment he first laid eyes on him. He was happy to finally have a grandson, but he allowed his wife's poison to spread into his brain and cloud his heart. He watched on as it ruined the family. James tells Paul he has just proven how very weak and pathetic he is. Regardless of the power he tried to exert over James, knowing how it feels to be an outsider in your own family, he can never make him hate his own child or grandchild. Taking out their rage on him without a care in the world as to how it would affect his well-being cannot be excused, no matter how they may have felt about his father. Standing up from his chair, Paul walks towards James, places his arm over James's shoulder, and says that this could be a new beginning for them. He might not have a lot of time left to make things right, and he's aware and willing to accept the fact that James may not want any part of it. James is entertained and oddly concerned, saying that he would consider things if Paul could answer why he listened to everything that Anastasia told him without ever asking if it were true or standing up to her. Shedding a few tears, Paul says that he felt he wasn't in a position to argue with Anastasia because they were both hurt by Hannah leaving. However, the main reason he listened to her without any question or struggle was because she forgave him for all the horrible things he had done in their marriage, in their many years of marriage. She stayed by his side, overlooking the lies, the cheating, the bastards, and the debt. There comes a day, he said, when you're forced with a hard decision, either to live the life you've always wanted or a peaceful life with your wife and family. Since family means everything, so there was no other choice but to listen to her. Unimpressed with the answer, James tells Paul things will never change as long as he continues to live in his wife's shadow. Now he says it's the time to change his own life, and that's why his move is a necessary one. But there's one thing James is willing to offer, and that's a long-distance relationship. He offers to talk to him on the phone from time to time. The only exception is that Paul doesn't ask James to forgive Anastasia. That will never happen. Happy to hear he's going to have a chance to build a relationship with his grandson, Paul, still tearful, tells James how much this all means, referencing that his health hasn't been the best lately. James doesn't bite, nor does he ask what's ailing Paul. To be honest, he's not really all that interested in building a relationship, but respects Paul for coming clean, even if it took years to do so. He tells Paul that it's time to leave in order to not miss the flight. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 6. The next one is chapter 7, starting over. And we will continue it next time. So until then, I'll see y'all later. Bye.